Yeah, so this book was dreamt up when I had a conversation with an academic. You know, most academics these days are a little bit slothful. They're not exactly intellectually very, very bright. And I was talking to a guy who claimed to be a philosopher. But he was the kind of philosopher that probably believed that Aristotle played right back for Queen's Park Ranger rather than did philosophy. And talking to him, I realized how the world had changed, because one of the first things he said to me when we were talking about Greek philosophy was that Aristotle was the father of white supremacy, and that white supremacy, white privilege, all these ideals that are in place now were somehow rooted within Greek philosophy, particularly the philosophical insights of Aristotle. And I was a little bit shocked by that, because although I know that academia these days is not exactly the high point of Western civilization, and in a sense is suffering very much from its intellectual deficit, I never imagined that anybody would associate white supremacy with Aristotle for a number of reasons. First of all, it meant nothing in ancient Greece. And secondly, if you actually study Aristotelian philosophy, you realize that he's providing us with the resources to really understand the human condition in a way that is very nuanced, and in a way that actually allows us to make sense of the existential problems, not just of his era, but also of our time. And then when I looked around, and this is especially the case in Brussels where I work, you kind of begin to realize that memory and history and the past have become probably the most important landscape on which the culture wars are being fought out. I think a lot of people think that the culture wars are about race or gender. They imagine that the culture wars are very much about identity politics, and they are about all these things. But ultimately, underpinning all the conflicts of values that we are engaged in is our view of what the past was all about. It's our conception of how the world worked in the previous time, in the previous era, what history is really all about. Because, as you know, all of our values, all of our insights into the human condition are built and are based upon the cumulative experience of the human imagination. You know, we are, whether we like it or not, the inheritors of that legacy. We make of it what we like, but whether we like it or not, we cannot escape from it, because it shapes our thinking, even if we are reacting to it. We're always positioning ourselves in relation to the past, whatever our political or ideological beliefs are. And one of the interesting things that I kind of write about is what I call the paradox of the past. And by the paradox of the past, what I mean is that on the one hand, we are continually told that the past was bad, that we should be ashamed of what human beings did in the past, particularly if we come from a Western culture. And there's a continuous sense in which the past becomes this dumping ground on which all the contemporary prejudices are thrown at. So on the one hand, we should really cut ourselves off from the past. We mustn't embrace the values of our ancestors, because everything that they stood for was somehow toxic, was somehow contaminated with their kind of prejudices that we no longer have. So leave the past behind, and let's not even think about it. But at the same time, there's an obsessiveness, a continuous obsessiveness where we can never let go of the past. And I think what's very interesting for me is that these days, when you pick up a new book, a book that is a reprint of a 1930s or 19th century author, the moment you open the book, it will say, it will have a kind of health warning on it. It will say, we need to tell you that the author of this book had the outdated ideas of the 1930s. Or we have to tell you that, and we must warn you, that there's a language that is being used that is now outdated, but was used in 1870 or 1880. It's a very weird idea, because when I pick up a book by Virginia Woolf, written in the 1920s, I expect her to express herself and to communicate a language of the 1920s. I do not expect Virginia Woolf to sound like some kind of Netflix cut-out woke character who is continually checking her privilege, because that really wasn't what Virginia Woolf was all about. So what's the point of telling me that somehow Virginia Woolf spoke the language of the 1920s? I mean, unless you're a complete idiot, you're aware of that. But of course, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is by highlighting the fact that Virginia Woolf communicated her imagination through the language of the 1920s, that's somehow contaminated, that's somehow morally inferior to the vocabulary and the medium of communication that we use in the 21st century. And that is why you have a situation where when you go to a museum, you enter a museum and you see, for example, as I have, a skull, a face in white of a Roman statue, a warrior just kind of there. There's a little health warning next to it saying that this particular statue that was kind of sculpted in the Roman era was probably motivated by an impulse to promote white supremacy. That somehow, because this particular skull was colored in white, it signaled something that had a racial dimension, rather than the fact that almost every sculpture you see of anything, whether they're pussycats or dogs or human beings, are likely to be in the same color. That's the way it was in those kind of days. But it doesn't matter. You're continually bombarded in virtually every cultural institution by these warnings, by these kind of scare warnings, these alarmist warnings that signal one idea and one idea alone, which is that everything that's in the bygone era is somehow morally inferior to our own era. And this is an important point, because what this attitude towards the past says is this. It doesn't just simply say that somebody living in the 17th, 18th, or 19th, 20th century did not know as much as we do, because obviously they knew less about the world than we in the 21st century. What they're also saying is that not only are they more ignorant than we are, they're also morally inferior. In other words, they're not as good a people as we are. And we in the 21st century are so aware, and that's the language that is used all the time by the culture war against the past. We are aware, whereas they were not aware that we somehow got to put them in their place. So that's really what it's all about. And therefore the paradox is that if you look at the way the past is discussed, it's almost as if it is very much alive. It's almost as if the temporal distinction between the present and the past does not exist. And you often get this situation where I remember watching in Portland, Oregon, a statue of somebody being pulled down, and everybody is getting their rocks up. This is like the high point of their life. And then as they kind of see the statue falling on the ground, they start kicking it, as if it's an alive human being. They're kind of basically having a go at the statue, as if it actually wasn't just a personification of some individual that was no longer alive, as if that statue was very much their contemporary. So that kind of temporal distinction between the present and the past is eroded. And that's one of the main subjects that I deal with in my book, because I think that has very deep and profound significance. So what I'm really discussing, and it's an important element in the culture wars, is that there's a very powerful impulse to settle score with the past. You're not settling scores with your contemporaries who are alive today. You're settling score with Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or even William Shakespeare for their particular deficits, their defects. And in a sense, when you have a situation where you're trying to teach the past and the individuals that personify the past a lesson, then somehow it kind of tells us that you're being distracted from dealing with the problems in the here and now. You're much more concerned with fixing the problems of the past than with engaging with people today. We live in a world where the attacks on the past, the hostility towards the past, leads to a situation where people who are living in the past or who made a name for themselves in the past, who are famous individuals that personify everything that is important and good about Western culture, are treated as if they are our peers, as if they are sitting next to us. So you have a situation, for example, where we have such an arrogant attitude towards people that we think that we know better than they do what they are really all about. So imagine this. One of the things I'm very much interested in is English literature, well, literature in general. But what do I do when I read a study of Othello, or when I read a study of The Tempest by Shakespeare, and the study is introduced by somebody who says that I felt the need to change Shakespeare's language? I say to myself, what the fuck is going on? I mean, why would you want to change Shakespeare's language? And then we're told the reason why you want to change Shakespeare's language is because by making the words within the play Othello more racist, or as racist as possible, we bring out the racial implications that Shakespeare was reluctant to express. Now, one of the things we can say about Shakespeare, he was not an inhibited guy. He wasn't reluctant to communicate and express himself. He had many, many other faults, but being embarrassed about communicating his views wasn't really one of them. But the very idea that somebody in the 21st century has the arrogance to know better than Shakespeare what Shakespeare really thought, in other words, that somehow in the 21st century can go into and invade the internal life of a 16th century poet and correct that poet and change the language, it seems to me, it indicates to me something that is quite unprecedented in the kind of cultural conflicts that we have. It's one thing to say, I don't like Shakespeare. It's even okay if you are confused about the world to say that Shakespeare was racist, which I don't think he was. I'm definitely not just think I know he wasn't, because that meaning had no meaning in that time. But it's quite another thing to put words in his mouth, to reinterpret what he was really saying, because you feel that you have the authority, that somehow somebody gave you the authority to change the past. And this is the point I really want to emphasize, because the war against the past is actually motivated by the conviction that you can actually change the past, right? You cannot, these are the people that are too scared to engage with the present and change the present. That's too tough a job. They're much more comfortable about going backwards and, at least metaphorically, changing the past and actually convincing themselves that thanks to their good work, we now have a better Shakespeare play than the one that the original author actually wrote. Now, I say this not because of Shakespeare being so important in and of himself, but because pretty much the same kind of orientation is directed towards every single individual that I know of who represents the best of human civilization, the best of Western civilization. Every individual that actually contributed to the intellectual development, to the moral development of the West, is rewritten in such a way that their personality is flattened, that they are turned into these second-rate idiots who do not understand the world as much as the very aware individuals that are living in our time. So that's something that I think we should bear in mind. And what we have here, in a sense, is a tendency, what I call in the book, of moral anachronism. And what moral anachronism really means is you read history backwards. You project your sentiments, you project your ideals, you project your concerns in the past, and you rediscover yourself. You rediscover your concerns in an entirely different era. What does that mean? It means, for example, that if you are into trans-ideology, and you think that trans-ideology is this eternal fact of life, then what you basically say that if in Egypt you discover some ancient human remains from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and you do a DNA test on those human remains, you're not allowed to say that according to the DNA test, this person was a woman or a man. That's not allowed, because by saying what you're doing is you're arrogantly identifying themselves in a way that might be very, very different than they would have done in the ancient Egyptian times. So the impulse behind it is that already 4,000 years ago, these pharaohs and their girlfriends and their boyfriends were already identifying in ways that is comparable to the way that we do in terms of the proliferation of different kinds of genders. So just stop for a second, because what we are saying is that what's important about ancient Egypt and the way that we culturally explore it is not what actually happened or the way that people saw themselves, because I can tell you one thing, those Egyptian people, did not have 120 genders, all right? In fact, they never even knew the meaning of what a gender is. That wasn't what their culture was really all about. But somehow we think that if they didn't, they should have. They should have had the same kind of moral imagination that we have in the 21st century. We have a situation where until very recently, good morning, you're late for class. Until very, very recently, people used to think that Joan of Arc, I don't know if you know Joan of Arc, she's quite a famous individual, particularly in French history. We used to think that Joan of Arc was a woman. I mean, that was our prejudice. We actually looked at her. She had all the external appearance of being a woman. That was how we saw her. But now we're told that apparently because Joan of Arc wore metal when she went to battle, had a metal shield, had a sword, it's unlikely that she really was a woman, because women in those days didn't wear all these metal stuff and their metal helmets and their swords. They stayed at home and looked after the children. So therefore, Joan of Arc is then redefined and seriously discussed. There are scholarly articles that are written about Joan of Arc as being a trans person. And this seems to be like a very powerful impulse, where you wake up one morning and you realize that all these people that you thought were either men or women have mutated into a different gender because of the way that the past is being not just reimagined, which is all right. I always reimagine the past, particularly my past. I think of my past in a very heroic kind of a way. That's perfectly all right. We all do it. But it's one thing to reimagine the past. It's another thing to, in a very rigid way, redefine human beings in accordance with your own prejudice, rather than look into the past and see and try to understand what was really there. So this very promiscuous way of moving back and forth means that the temporal distinction between the present and the past is becoming more and more eroded. And what that means, those of you that are interested in cultural studies, is that if you look at a historical play, or a historical film about anything, especially on Netflix, I mean, Netflix is like the worst, maybe even the best, medium of entertainment, because what it does systematically is that whenever it discusses the past, and whenever you see a film or a series about the past, it basically projects present-day concerns, particularly California concerns, onto the world. And we could be talking about the Vikings in Norway. We could be talking about the Anglo-Saxons in England. We can talk about Africans living in Sudan or elsewhere. And suddenly, you discover yourself and your concerns. So, for example, we had a TV program that I wished I had seen before the book was finished. And it's a TV program about Sweden. It's the most expensive single TV program that exists in Sweden. And it's about the history of Sweden. And And the program, it's a caricature because it begins by saying that most people don't realize, but actually the original inhabitants of Sweden were Africans. They were black people. So the very first section, you struggle to find a single Scandinavian-looking blonde person in that program. They don't exist. And instead what you have is a depiction of a village that reminds me of the Africa that I visited when I was doing my PhD there. That somehow you have this kind of complete inversion. And by the time you get to the 18th, 19th century, you have a situation where Sweden becomes this homeland of diversity, where there's a lot of people that exist there, a lot of people that do good stuff and all those other things. But Sweden suddenly becomes something that is totally alien to what it really was all about. And similarly, you will have, depictions in Rome where essentially Rome is dominated by identity politics rather than the imperial ambitions of Roman society. So you have the breakdown of temporal distinctions, and this is self-consciously done. So, for example, there are academics in our university whose specialty is the queering of history. Right? The queering of history. And basically what that means is almost as if you are a grievance archaeologist, you go back and you look for signs of queering in every single dimension of human experience. And you basically then come up with the most absurd ideas, whereby, in a sense, on a battleship that's kind of leaving Southampton to fight the French or to fight the Spanish, there literally is not a single heterosexual sailor. Right? That they are conspicuous by their absence. And everybody on that boat, everyone on that boat would feel very, very comfortable in the gay clubs of Soho, because that's really where they would have been otherwise. So this kind of queering of history, or the decolonizing of history, is really very interesting, because what the authors of the decolonization of history do is to turn colonialism into an existential defining moment in human history. So colonialism becomes not something that kicked in the late 18th century and then flourished in the 19th century and the 20th century. Colonialism becomes this kind of original sin that was always there in history. And even if colonialism wasn't there, everything that preceded colonialism led up to it. It's kind of a teleology of sin, where already in ancient Greece, the fathers of democracy, the fathers of philosophy, of the greatness, at least in my eyes, of Greek civilization, were already perpetuating and creating a dynamic that would inevitably, inexorably lead to colonialism. And everything today becomes simply a remnant, a legacy of that colonial. So everything becomes reduced to that particular fact. And therefore what you have is a situation where there's tremendous scope for fantasy about dealing with these kinds of situations. In my book, I call this approach year zero ideology. And by year zero ideology, what I'm talking about is a situation where essentially what you're saying is everything that's gone before now is by definition inferior to our world. It's bad. It's malevolent. We have to cut ourselves off from the past, create this year zero ideal where all the good things begin now because we are more aware, we're more sensitive, we know things that other people didn't know in the past, and therefore what we do is call for a situation where we seek to detach our world from the legacy of human experience. We seek to existentially distance ourselves from what has gone on beforehand. And that has got very important implications. Because what I think happens is that when you distort history in this way, when you attack history in this kind of systematic way, you deprive us not only of the human and moral resources, which are the foundation on which we can move forward in our world, because without the legacy of the past, without the wisdom of our ancestors, we are nothing. We are absolutely nothing because we lost all that important, vital insights that have been gained through hard struggle over the centuries. So not only are we deprived and dispossessed of those elements, but more importantly, our very idea of freedom cannot exist. Freedom is not something that you kind of dream of. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth and say, I want to be free. Freedom is something that evolves century by century through bitter struggle, through learning from that experience that people have gone through learning from your mistakes, through knowing what its opposite is. You cannot have an idea of freedom unless you know what unfreedom is. Right? You cannot have an idea of liberation unless you have an idea of what it is to be exploited, oppressed, enslaved. Right? None of those things comes about by magic. They come about through the struggle of history. Now we write that all off, and we basically say that all those people that have fought for our world and humanized our world were inferior to us and were ultimately complicit in all kinds of oppressive behavior, then what we are basically saying that a human being is a low beast of little worth. Human beings made the world worse than it would have been otherwise. And that's what some of them are saying. I mean, if you look at ecological historians, they basically now argue that human beings are essentially parasites, that the world, the planet would have been better off if humanity has never existed. And that kind of misanthropic, malevolent idealization of our past has got some very, very serious consequences. And I just want to end on one thing, which are particularly concerned to me. See, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that your generation and the generation before and the generation before, the last 3 or 4 generations of young people have been systematically dispossessed of the intellectual and moral legacy of humanity. The education that you've gone through is one which has continually given a warning sign: beware of the past, we're better than they are. I look at a curriculum on sex education, and the sex education curriculum says, you probably understand your needs better than your parents. You probably understand questions to do with sex and relationships better than your mother or your grandmother. Right? In other words, what we're telling young people is that the insights of the past, what we learned from before, are not worth very much, that you know better. And that might flatter you. That might say, oh, that's really cool. I know more than my mom and dad and my grandparents. But what you really are doing here is actually leaving you detached from any of the experience of the past in a way that disallows you from having the strength, the autonomy, and the notion of independence to make your way in the world. Because if you really are detached from the past, if you live in this ever-present, where the past is nothing worth thinking about and celebrating, then what we've done is we lost our way entirely. Because without understanding where we've come from, it is really impossible to know what is the direction of future travel. And that is why we live in a world, and this is what I want to end on, where our society, Western society, has become entirely trapped in the ever-present. It denounced the past, it renounced the past, it kind of cut itself off from the past, and by so doing, it's trapped in the present, which is why it finds it so difficult to have an orientation that's future-oriented, that looks to the future and attempts to create a world that actually really is better. Because the one thing that we can do is we can change our world and build a better future, but the one thing we cannot do is to change our past. Thank you.